Well, welcome everyone, and thank you again for being with us. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful 4th of July weekend. Lori and I wish everyone a happy 4th. We hope that you're celebrating safely and joyfully. What great weather, or at least we're having here, for cookouts and fireworks and baseball games and hot dogs and all of the things that have become associated with celebrating Independence Day, the 4th of July here in this country. We want to talk a little bit this morning about spiritual freedom, and it's an absolutely wonderful celebration, the Independence Day, the 4th of July, especially when we look at it from a spiritual perspective. Excuse me. Dr. Holmes talks a lot about freedom in the textbook, and if you have a textbook, just go in the back and look up the references to freedom. And he talks about freedom being our birthright, freedom being our very nature. And that bondage is not God ordained, that it is something that we bring to ourselves, a lack or limitation, our illnesses, all of those things we bring to ourselves through our misuse of the very power that would set us free. We're not being punished, but we are in a process of learning what we are and growing, and that eventually all these things that have appeared to hold us back, excuse me, will fade away, will dissolve into the nothingness from which they came. So we're reminded of that on Independence Day. And then Emmett Fox, one of my favorite teachers, Emmett Fox, wrote a wonderful pamphlet. I believe it's called The Spiritual Destiny of the United States. And he follows the evolution of political structures throughout time and observes the fact that as humankind's concept of what governments are and what they are for and what their purpose is, as that kind of evolved, and we want to keep this evolution in mind, that it unfolds over time. If you go back from thousands of years and look at it and watch it unfold over time, that what has been happening is we as people are evolving into structures that celebrate more the freedom of the individual, recognize the freedom of the individual. And then we get to look at the Declaration of Independence itself, that beautiful document that gets read so many times, and it's great that it gets read so many times over and over and over again at this time of the year. But we can look at it as a prayer. We can look at that Declaration of Independence, and if we analyze it in the way that we would analyze the structure of a prayer. And remember, in the New Testament, the disciples said to Jesus, teach us how to pray. They didn't say, teach us what to pray for. They said, teach us how to pray. And he gave them a template. He gave them an outline. It started with the recognition of God and went on through the acceptance or the declaration of what it is that they would have, our daily bread, or forgiveness. And if we look at the Declaration of Independence the same way we would look at analyzing a prayer or a spiritual mind treatment, we can see that it is laid out in a manner that very definitely sets in motion that immutable law, the inevitableness of God, because it is based on spiritual principles, whether the people who wrote it knew so or not. It is. And we can actually see, as we look around us, and if we study the history of the United States of America with those eyes, we can see that our history, what is going on, the good and the bad, and I think, as we watch the programs this 4th of July weekend, everybody's talking about all of the good, and nobody's talking about the bad. And the bad is there. It's there. It's a part of the experience. And what is going on is some of the turmoil that we're facing and the conflict and the wars that we have gone through and we are going through are the unfoldment, if you will, the movement of this Declaration of Independence. There are things that needed to be let go of in our collective consciousness. And we held on to them, and we didn't want to let them go. We human beings, not we, you and I, but we human beings. And whenever we declare our intent to change, we have to let go of those things that have been keeping us where we were. And if we won't let go of them willingly, but if we firmly believe and are committed to our change, they will go with a struggle, but they will go. And of course, then it all comes down and back to, but what about us individually? What does this idea of freedom under the law, as Dr. Holmes would call it, spiritual freedom, freedom being our destiny, what does it all mean to us individually? So let's take a look at some of these ideas quickly today. And I guess what I would hope, the feeling that I got as these ideas kind of came to me and formulated this morning, is this idea of enthusiasm, this idea of excitement, this idea of celebration of what it is that is going on within us, of what it is that is available to us. The unlimited power, the immutable power to change, to experience that which we wish, If we could just think that we could all get out into a big stadium someplace and watch the fireworks and wave the banners and sing the songs, and what we're singing about is to celebrate the freedom which is our birthright, which is our God-given nature. But more importantly, to celebrate our decision to cooperate with it, to work with it. There's one thing to know about it, it's another thing to use it. And I hope we get inspired to use it, excited about using it. So if you think about what's going on here, what we're celebrating in the United States at this time, we're celebrating the Declaration of Independence. We're celebrating the signing of a formal document in which the leaders of the colonies at that time, the founders of America, we would now call them, but they were leaders of the colonies of Britain, but they made a formal statement of their intention to be free, their formal statement of their declaration to exercise what they declared to be their own God-given right to choose for themselves. Now, we would look at that today and say, well, yes, but each and every person, each and every one has that same right and that same responsibility and the same accountability. But isn't it interesting that the day that we celebrate, of all of the days, of all of the things that we could celebrate in America that are associated with the American Revolution, we celebrate the day that was designated as the formal day when the decision was made. Now, it actually wasn't made on that day. It was made over time. But that day was chosen as a day when it would be celebrated. But even before the Declaration of Independence became official, there were other events going on in the colonies. Of course, we had the battles at Lexington and Concord. In the state of North Carolina, the colonial governor was actually trying to rule in exile off of a British ship anchored off of the coast near the mouth of the Cape Fear River in Wilmington, near Southport. And there were some loyalists who were trying to march down to Southport to meet up with some British troops that were going to come ashore, and they were going to free the governor and reinstate the governor to his colonial rule. And some of the colonists came out and met them and stopped them at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. Just a little history lesson, but it took place a full 4 months before the Declaration of Independence. Up here near Charlotte, Mecklenburg County claims that they had written their own Declaration of Independence some time before the official Declaration of Independence, and they sent a writer to Philadelphia, Captain Jack. I remember the history lesson when our kids were small. Captain Jack rode his horse from Charlotte, North Carolina, up to Philadelphia to deliver the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. And all that I'm saying is that this was an evolving process. There was stuff going on. There was what Emerson might call the divine discontent was in play. Okay, there was something going on where people knew and wanted change. They wanted change. And what they wanted was freedom. They wanted their desire to be free. Now, we don't celebrate the great battles of the American Revolution as the major holiday associated with our independence, and there are many of those. We don't celebrate the day in October when Cornwallis formally surrendered at Yorktown, and for all practical purposes, the war was over. We don't celebrate the day in January of 1884, full 8 years later, 7.5, 8 years later, when our Congress finally ratified the Treaty of Versailles. And that's the day that the war officially ended for us. I mean, I never knew that. We were effectively at war, state of war, until 1884 when it ended. We don't celebrate those days as much as we celebrate the day that the decision was made. The day that our leaders declared that freedom is a God-given right and we shall have it. And they committed everything they had to that purpose. Everything. Their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honors. There's a quote attributed to John Adams, one of the leaders of the colonies at that time, where he allegedly said, "If we fail, I pray that they grease the rope before they hang us." He knew what the consequences of his decision were. He knew that if the revolution failed, he would be tried as a traitor. If you think about the patience sometimes exhibited by George Washington in the battles when, it was tough to get supplies to him and raise the money and do all the things that needed to be done to help the army in the field win. And here was a man who, if he was caught, he was going to be killed. And it seems to me that he exhibited a great amount of grace under pressure, knowing the consequences of what would happen. There's a time when there was a battle in Boston, and Boston was set ablaze, and John Hancock is allegedly quoted as saying, "Burn, Boston, burn, although it makes John Hancock a beggar." And my point there is that these were not just mere words to these folks, to the people who put their names down on them. They understood the consequences. One of the signers of the Declaration from North Carolina was a gentleman named Thomas Hooper, who had residence in both Hillsborough and in Wilmington. And I lived in Wilmington less than 2 miles from his house, where he lived on Masonboro Sound. For those who are familiar with Wilmington, about halfway between Wrightsville Beach and Carolina Beach, right along the Intercoastal Waterway. Excuse me. There was a plantation there, and Hooper lived in that house. And the British went so far as to bring their warships into Masonboro Sound and to find his house and to shell it from the cannon fire from the ships. The people knew that what they were doing was they were committing everything they had. There was no wishy-washiness about it. They were committing everything they had. They made their declaration. They stated that they would have it if it cost them their very lives. And for those who understand the power of the law of mind, of what we're talking about when we talk about spiritual mind treatment, I think you can understand what they did. And if we truly understand what they did, if we truly understand the power that moved through that decision, we understand why that day was chosen to celebrate, as opposed to the battles, as opposed to the surrenders, as opposed to the treaties. The most important step in the whole process was making up their minds, was declaring that which they should have. Now, Dr. Holmes tells us when we look at freedom, we have to consider that freedom is the very nature of God, that God itself is free. There's nothing that could be against God. There's not God and something else. There's just God. And there's nothing that could limit or restrain or restrict God other than its own nature. And what I mean by that is the divine cannot act against itself. It can't do something that is against its own nature. You've heard the riddle, can God make a rock so big that God can't pick it up? God can't act against its own nature. That which is life cannot cause death. That which is health cannot cause disease. See? The divine is the epitome of very freedom. It decides what it shall have. It has will and volition. And then through a process of unfoldment, right? Its decision is the involution, and the unfoldment is the evolution. And through this process of unfoldment, which we would say is the law of mind in motion, for lack of something better to call it, there's a very part of God that when the divine makes up its mind as to what it shall experience, there is something that takes that decision and brings it into fruition. And this is represented to us in the creation myths of the different cultures. And the one that we're most familiar with here in our society, of course, is the creation in Genesis. In the beginning there was void and there was chaos. But the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, let it be, let it be. Right? Let there be stars and planets, let it be. Let there be plants and animals, let it be. And these things came into being. So what we're being told there, John said it later on, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt amongst us. There is a creative process by which the divine decides, and after the divine decides, after it says let it be, after it makes its declaration, there is something else that takes over. Excuse me. Excuse me. Get a drink of water. Cold is almost gone. There is something else that takes over, and then there's the evolution. There is the actual coming into being, coming into experience of that which the divine has declared. Now we know this here as a process of evolution. It may take millions of years, and please keep that in mind. It takes millions of years. It takes a long time from our perspective for this unfoldment to take place, for whatever needs must be to happen. You can see kind of the spiritual law in action. You can see how when life started there might be one single cell, and then they bonded together and they formed organisms, and they formed species, and so on and so on and so on over time. But the divine speaks its word, and something acts upon that word. There is the involution, the speaking. There is the evolution, the unfoldment. And what Dr. Holmes tells us is that whatever unfolds must be of the nature of cause. Right? And the very nature of God, the very nature of cause is freedom. What the divine decides to have, it has. It experiences. There's nothing that can stop it. It is immutable. It is bound to happen. It is inevitable, as Emma Curtis Hopkins would tell us. And this, of course, is the definition of freedom. Freedom to be, to do, to have whatever it decides. There is nothing that can stand in the way. Nothing can stop us. So the divine creates out of its image and likeness. And what Dr. Holmes tells us is that it has created us as individualized expressions of itself. But in order for us to be individualized, we could not come into awareness. We could not become into our consciousness fully aware of the power at our disposal. In other words, there's a process that was required of us to learn. And in that learning process, we become unique. And in becoming unique, we become individual. So if we all came into existence fully aware, fully enlightened, fully realized beings, there would be no uniqueness. There would be no individualization. We would all be like little robots, little automatons. In some of the mystical teachings, they talk about the emptying out. That the souls, the souls, were in heaven, and Spirit wanted to express and experience itself in unique and different ways. So it created the souls. But the souls were in heaven, and they were very close to God. And they lacked nothing, because they were right there in the midst of everything. So the souls made a conscious decision to empty themselves of all they had, to leave the garden, and to go into the time-space experience, and to discover everything anew. And in the process of discovering everything anew, to have the experience of good and the experience of evil, because it was necessary. If we were empty, it would appear that we could experience lack, as we are learning to fill ourselves back up. Now, I don't know that that's true. I know that that's a teaching story in some traditions. But as most teaching stories, I think it does a pretty good job of illustrating the point. The story of the garden, we were with God. We walked in the cool of the evening with God. Everything that we wanted was there. But there was something else within us. There was something else that we wanted to do, and that was to participate in creation, to go out and to be unique, individualized starting points where life could experience itself anew through us. So we left the garden. And what we're doing now is we're walking each other home. We're getting ourselves back into the garden. So what Dr. Holmes tells us is that freedom is our birthright. Excuse me. And freedom is our destiny. And that in the process of walking our way back home, we inevitably use the power that could set us free to put ourselves in bondage. We can use fire to burn ourselves, or to heat our homes, or to cook our food. And sometimes we make mistakes, and as we make mistakes, because the law is always acting upon our belief, as we believe in lack and limitation, we experience lack and limitation until we get over that. Until we make our declaration that we just won't do that again. We just don't want to experience that again. So we have to remember that freedom is the very nature of God, and we are created out of the very nature of God, and therefore freedom is our nature as well. So when the founders said that we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights of life, of liberty, and of the pursuit of happiness, what they were stating is exactly the same thing, that is our very nature of God, that we have been created for this purpose to experience these things. So Emmett Fox takes a look at this from kind of an historical perspective. And he says, if you think about, what is the destiny of humanity? What is the destiny of our political structures, if you will? And he used the United States as an example, of course, because he was here at the time. He had come from England, and he was here at the time. But when I read his pamphlet, he was speaking not only of this country, this geographical area, but he was speaking to this idea of what is the purpose of government, and where is government moving, and where is it taking us? And the first thing I think we want to keep in mind when we look at this is the amount of time that it takes, right? So we as human beings, we tend to judge things in very, very short time frames. One lifetime. If it doesn't happen in one lifetime, it's never going to happen as far as we're concerned. We look at things around us and we're very, very impatient. I was reading something about videos, marketing videos on YouTube, and commercials and things like that. And what they were saying is that most people will give the video 10 seconds, and if it doesn't grab them in 10 seconds, they're done with it. They move off of it. And this is why these videos just try to do something dramatic to reach out and grab you in the beginning. They play sirens or make some kind of sounds that'll get your attention. They're trying to do something, anything, to gain your attention because our attention span is so short. But we have to step back a little bit. We have to look at things in the terms of a process of evolution that is taking millions of years, more than one human lifetime. Remember, we are part of that which is never born and never dies. We are part of that which is eternal and immortal. So where we come from and where we go is a subject of great debate. But we have to step back and stop trying to look at the whole history of the evolution of human consciousness from within the constraints of just one time frame. So Thomas Troward tells us, if you look at evolution, if you look at physical evolution, right, and Emmett Fox was a student of Troward's. So Troward says if you look at physical evolution, that as everything evolves, it evolves in two directions, along two lines. A greater sense of movement, freedom, excuse me, and a greater degree of intelligence. We start with a single-celled animal just kind of floating around in the sea, has very limited or no movement, and it just has to float around and wait for its nutrients to come for it or to it. And then over time, those cells come together and they kind of specialize. And they're able to develop fins and flippers and move and mouths and stomachs and digestive organs. And you can see that the impulse of life is to go to greater freedom, to greater movement, to greater intelligence. Life evolves over millions and billions of years, and life evolves, and it's always evolving along those two lines. It's always evolving to a greater degree of freedom of movement and freedom of thinking, intelligence. And Emmett Fox says if we look at that in terms of the evolution of human consciousness, we can see a pattern in the way that the governments have evolved. And in order to demonstrate how slowly human consciousness evolves, Emmett Fox asks us to consider that we can read the stories in the Old Testament. It took place 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Excuse me. We can read those stories and we can understand what's going on because we're not too different than those people. We can relate to them. We can read the stories about what the Pharaoh was thinking and the Pharaoh was doing, and we can relate to that. We know somebody just like that, probably the boss, but we know somebody just like that. So we have to understand that left of its own accord, or another way to think of it is the general level of human consciousness, it unfolds very slowly. It is awakening very slowly. Now, individuals within that collective consciousness, individuals can take action themselves to expedite, if you will, their unfoldment and their awakening. This is, of course, what the great spiritual teachers have taught. But collectively, things move very slowly. And what Emmett Fox was telling us in the Spiritual Destiny of the United States is that if you look at the unfoldment of governments and the idea of where governments get their power from and the purpose of governments, you can see that there has been an evolution, there has been a shift. So the first kind of ideas that we had or maybe collective ideas, that the individual was just a member of a bigger organization, the tribe, the state, whatever it might be. And the individual's own wants and desires were subservient to the collective. People came together for mutual protection, if you will. They came together because it enhanced their chances of survival by being together. Excuse me. And within that, the idea of the individual was not as important as the idea of the collective, of the state. We kind of moved through the tribal system. We moved into kind of like an evolution of that, the feudal system. You know, there was still this Lord Protector who had the castle and employed the knights. And the Lord Protector claimed all the lands as his or her own, and then paid the knights in parcels of land, made them the landlords and landholders. And they were going to go out and do the warfare, and through their actions on the battlefield, through their prowess in military powers, somehow the security of the people was better off than it would be without them. And again, in that idea of government, the rights of the individual were not as important as the rights of the king of the castle. They were subservient. They didn't own anything. Whatever they had was given to them by the landlords, by the kings. And they worked and they provided. But their individual desires were not as important as what the rulers had decided. Excuse me. And then that system itself started to collapse. And there was a shift, and we recognize it from Anglo-American history. We recognize it at the time of the signing of the Magna Carta, which was basically there was a shift in consciousness where the people went to the king and said, wait a second, you don't rule because God put you in charge, and you get to tell us what to do, and we are without our own rights, but rather you rule with our consent. It was a great shift in consciousness that took place at that time, that the rulers actually got to rule with the consent of the people, by the consent of the people. They were still in charge, they still made decisions, but it was important that their decisions be perceived to be with the consent of the people. And then we move through time, and we come to this continent, where the Europeans come to this continent, and another shift takes place. And that shift that takes place at least among the European consciousness, because there were other societies that had these ideas before they came to the United States. As a matter of fact, when Benjamin Franklin went out and tried to find the best way to form a government, he studied the Algonquians, the Algonquian Indians in America. And our system of government is largely based upon the way the Algonquins had ruled. The three branches of government. If you look at some of the Tibetan societies, the purpose of the society was to support the spiritual growth of the individual. So there were other societies that had different concepts, but when the Europeans came to this continent, another shift took place. And that shift was not that the rulers ruled with the consent of the people, but that the people actually ruled. That the people were the owners of the country, that the individuals were the ones who made the decisions, and that they employed the rulers. They directly hired and fired the rulers through the electoral process, because they, the people, were the ones who were in charge. And what Emmett Fox tells us is that the inevitableness of this, what's going to happen and where we're going to go is that we must realize eventually that each and every one of us is responsible for and accountable for and in charge of deciding for ourselves and deciding for our lives what it is that we will have. And we will throw off our dependency of the ideas that we need anyone else to do this for us. That we can eventually evolve to that, the utopian state that so many people have dreamt of in so many cultures for so many years, a state where everybody is engaged in activity that is fulfilling, that everybody is engaged in activity that is a celebration of the self, that is a celebration of the soul, that the need for laws and prisons and those kind of things goes away eventually because people realize that you cannot steal. What the commandment is saying, it's translated, thou shalt not steal, but it means you cannot steal because there's only one, and you're part of that one, and what you take from another you have taken from yourself. That life is a game of boomerangs, that what you give out, you give back. So Emmett Fox was saying that eventually over time, that as individuals grow spiritually, their idea of what governments are for, to preserve our rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, eventually those ideas change as we, the individuals, change, as we, the individuals, grow. Now, if we look at the Declaration of Independence and try to analyze it as a prayer, I think it's pretty clear if we think about it. Jefferson started out writing, that these are God-given rights. So he started out including the idea of the divine, and that which they were declaring already existed in the mind of God. Right? There's certain God-given rights, which is where we start. Which is where we start our process of prayer. What do we know about this situation as it pertains to God? Well, God already is free. God has already created each and every one of us to be free. We are God's instruments of freedom. These are the first two steps of treatment. And then they went on to declare what they would have. They stated it very clearly what they would have: the right to self-govern, the right to choose, the right to decide. And they committed to it. They committed to it wholeheartedly. With lives, with fortunes, with sacred honor. And I think that's an important step for us to consider. In that many times we may do our prayer, we may do our treatment, but how committed are we to it? How much do we really want it? You know the Eastern parable, do you want God as much as you'd want a pond when your hair was on fire? How much do we want it? What are we willing to commit to it? Are we willing to give up everything, to release and let go of everything in our lives that have to change? And this is what they did in the Declaration of Independence. Excuse me. And then what they did is they started immediately to act as if. See, this is why the Declaration of Independence is the day that we celebrate our freedom, because we didn't wait until the treaty was signed to start to act as if. We didn't wait until the surrender at Yorktown to start to act as if. We didn't say, well, we're not going to really be a country until all that takes place. We said we are a country. We are an independent country, and we are in the process of exercising that freedom. So they started to do the things that you needed to do, or they needed to do, in order to form the more perfect union. They formed the armies. They formed the legislators. They started to do the things to act as if. And that's what we need to do, and we need to do when we do our prayer and we do our treatment. We need to act as if. And then, of course, there was a lot of turmoil after that. And I think this is important to keep in mind, to consider, as I said before, the bad along with the good. There was a lot of turmoil that followed after that. There was not only the Revolutionary War and the sacrifice and the battles and the loss of life and the suffering that took place there, but we went on to the Civil War, an unfoldment of the Declaration of Independence that said all men are created equal. And keep in mind what was going on. Here are the founders who signed the Declaration of Independence. Pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors to the idea that all men are created equal. Somehow they made an exclusion. Somehow they said yes, but that does not include the African American slaves. And of course that was wrong. All men are created equal. And that error had to be corrected because they had set into motion the power of the law of mind. So the struggle took place in order to correct the error in thinking that people would not let go of easily. And then later on, in perhaps a more peaceful manner, through the legislative process, we corrected another error. And said, oh, it's all men and women. It's all persons are created equal and endowed by their Creator. So what I'm pointing out is that we see a great deal of struggle going on in our political processes today. It is sometimes comical to watch, as you can see the old consciousness trying to hold on and cling and fight and resist change. And yet there's another power that is sweeping through and forcing that change to come. And I view that as being the unfoldment of the prayer of the Declaration of Independence. You know, I don't think that you would get very many people to complain about the reading of the Declaration of Independence. And as I said, it's read many, many times this weekend. But if you think about what people are doing, whether they know it or not, what they are doing is that they are making an affirmative prayer. That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the inalienable rights of everyone, and nothing can get in the way. And I think that act does more to bring about positive change in our society than anything else, perhaps, that we do. Now, this all comes back to us because, as Emmett Fox said, we eventually learned that we are the ones that are in charge. We are the ones that are ruling. We are the ones that need to make up our mind, and this is most important. We need to make up our mind about what it is that we shall have. See, I think what happens to us is we achieve levels of comfort and we get into a comfort zone and we stop choosing for a while. We stop thinking for a while. We stop being deliberate about what it is that we will have. As the Dalai Lama says, we get pleasure and happiness confused. Our goal is to be happy, but when we find something that brings us pleasure, we stop and we spend time with it until eventually it brings us pain, and then we move forward again. But what we must come to realize is that every day is the day to declare our independence. Every day is the 4th of July for us. We can't just do it once and wait 250 years and then do it again. Each and every day that we awaken, we must decide what it is that we will have that day. How we will allow the love of God and the peace of God to express through us and the joy of God to express through us. How we will be that blessing in the lives of those around us. Each and every one, the rich and the poor, those who are experiencing suffering, and those who are not. Each and every day we are required to decide, because the power that responds to our thoughts doesn't care whether we have decided consciously or unconsciously. We have the responsibility to choose, and we are accountable for choosing. We have to awaken to that. That is our destiny. We have to submit to that because that is the way that it works and we can't change it. But what we can do is we can decide. We can choose deliberately. We can recognize that what we are choosing is something that has come from God. And we can declare our willingness to give up each and everything in our consciousness that might be in the way. Everything that must change in order for the answered prayer, the demonstration, to make its appearance in our lives. Many years ago, Lori and I went out to Seattle, Washington, to visit our oldest child lives out there. And we took a drive to explore the scenery. We went up towards Bellingham, out to, I think it's Anacortes, with the Alaska ferry terminal up there. And then we went out to the islands, the San Juan Islands, and we started to drive back down towards Seattle. We went through Bainbridge Island. And my God, it's absolutely gorgeous if you ever get a chance to go there. It's the only rainforest in the contiguous 48 states is out there on Bainbridge Island. Amazing, amazing beauty, just spectacular. And when we got further south, when we got close to Seattle, I don't remember where we were, but we got on a ferry boat that went back over to Seattle. And it was getting to be late in the evening, just maybe an hour or so till sunset. And as the ferry left the slip and came out of the little cove where the ferry terminal was, and we started across, I guess it was Elliott Bay. We started across Elliott Bay back towards Seattle. We came to an area that was just filled with sailboats. I don't know that I've ever seen as many sailboats in one place in my life as there were that day out on Elliott Bay. There were some that were big, 40 or 50 feet. There were some that were small, maybe 10 or 12 feet. There were sails of all different colors, mostly white, but there were some yellow ones, there were some red ones. The hulls were painted in many different colors. Again, white was predominant, but there were some that were bright red, and others that were bright blue, and some that were bright green. And it was just this spectacular visual treat of different colors, each and every way. As I say, some were small and they were open boats, and people were sitting in there with their life jackets on and controlling the tiller with their hands. And others were big. They were like motor cruisers, looked like an apartment that was floating, like a 2 or 3 story apartment where people could live, and there was a sail stuck on top of this thing. And some were going west, and some were going east, and some were going north, and some were going south, and some were going at every point in between. It's just amazing. And what occurred to me when I looked at it is, there's only one wind. There's only one wind. Yet each and every person was able to choose how they were going to interact with that wind, how they were going to express the wind, if you want to think of it that way, in their own unique way, in big, in little, in plain colors, in fabulous colors. Going this way, going that way, going the other. Each and every person out there on the boat that day was a unique, individualized expression of God, individualizing the power that is available to all, the power of the wind. And what I hope we remember this day is that each and every one of us is an individualized expression of God's love, and each and every one of us has the responsibility to decide how we are going to do this thing called life. Are you going to do it with a big bright red sail? Are you going to do it with a white sail? Are you going to do it with a huge hull with 3 stories? Or are you going to do it in a small sailing canoe? Are you going to head east or west or north or south? What is it that fulfills your heart? What is it that allows you to experience God more fully? And do you recognize and realize that you are completely free to do it, but you must decide. You must declare. No one else can do it for you. Your clergy can't do it for you. Your parents can't do it for you. Your teachers can't do it for you. And your government darn sure can't do it for you. You are the one who has to decide what freedom, what fulfillment, and what happiness mean to you. You must declare that you will have it. You must be willing to release and let go of everything and anything in your consciousness that stands in the way. And you must be willing to undergo the turmoil if necessary, the struggle that may take place if there are things that you need to let go of that you won't. But we can all rest assured that through the immutable power, through the inevitableness of God, that each and every one of us will arrive at our destination safe, sound, whole, and complete, but most of all, unique. You are a beautiful, individualized expression of God. I invite you today, declare that independence. Declare what you will have and do it each and every day for as long as you live. And so it is.